G'day everybody, it's Dan here at Pilates with Dan with your next installment of our hip and pelvis exercise tutorials. Today we'll be tackling an exercise which is known as the single leg stretch. Quite often we introduce this exercise to newer clients. It's their first sort of more complicated movement. Once they've got some of the basics down. And it might be a bit surprising because quite often it's considered to be kind of an abdominal exercise, but the way I want to look at it in terms of the hip and pelvis is what's actually happening at the hip joint as you're doing this movement. And I really love this exercise because it gives you your hip joint a really big range of motion. And I've been talking about this with my students here this term of classes, in encouraging them to actually explore their range of motion through the hip joint, through lots of deep hip flexion and into hip extension as well. So you'll be able to see in terms of this exercise that range of motion. I also want to present a few alternatives because sometimes people aren't too happy with that deep range of motion. And I want to be able to present alternatives that you can actually do at home if things are not happy for you in different areas. Okay. All right. So the exercise itself, I'll take you through the full version of how we do it here, and then we'll go through a couple of different modifications so that you can continue to do the action and the intent that we want you to do at the same time as everybody else in a class situation. Okay, so we're going to be starting laying supine, so on our backs. And the movement itself, think of it as a advancement on something like the 100. Okay, so if you think about the 100, whatever version of the 100 you're doing, you're in a held chest lifted position. So you're working through the abdominals. The pelvis is staying stable, it should be, right, as you're doing the movement. So think of this, the single leg stretch, is a chance now for the legs to do some movement as you're doing an abdominal exercise, okay? So the way we cue is to bring the legs up to tabletop. You can choose to come up into a chest lift with the support of the hands if that's what you need. Or it may be taught that we've just finished the 100 or a similar exercise and you're already in a chest lifted position. Either way, we want you in a chest lifted position to get that upper abdominal work. Now from here, this is where it gets a little bit exciting, I think. You're going to be extending one leg out. Now traditionally, the movement, the leg goes out quite low. Okay, and that's cool, because we're still working with that deep hip flexion. You can see that shape there. Okay, now I always cue, the goal is to try and get that knee on that shoulder. Okay, so you're getting that lovely hip flexion. Now not everybody can do that, obviously, and I'm aware of that. Okay, so even though I might cue it, I'm aware that everybody's got their own limitations. Okay, now all I want you to encourage is deep hip flexion, whatever shape that is for you. You can use your hands here to help manipulate you into position. The other leg, in our school of Pilates, we quite often try and keep it about the same height, or the feet at the same height. You can go lower, but in doing so, I don't want you to sacrifice your pelvis and lower back. Okay, so the height of the leg can actually help assist you to achieve the hip flexion portion of the single leg stretch. So if you're struggling with a hip flexor issue or a lower back issue, we may ask you to come up a little bit higher. Okay, so you're still getting extension of the leg, but the focus here is on this flexion. It's an exhale to switch it around, exhale to switch it around, switch, switch. Okay, so that's the movement. Quite often we do a series of about 12 repetitions. You can do less, you can do more, that's fine. But the focus with that one is to get deep hip flexion as the other leg extends out, and the pelvic stability required to maintain your position. Okay? Advancements on that are some of the other exercises of the 5. Things like crisscross, where you're then rotating as well. You can think of that as kind of an advancement. Same movement, but adding an extra layer of abdominal work. Okay, but if you peel it back and think about just the hip and pelvis joint, you're doing the same motion. Okay, so some modifications. So say, for example, you're not super happy in terms of the leg lengths, and so we've talked about the height of the leg, so you can modify the height of the leg. Another thing that I sometimes do with the beginners is ask them to still perform a leg movement, but a slightly different leg movement. So, for example, what we can do is, after doing a chest lift, do a toe tap. So here we're still working the leg or the hip joint through flexion and some extension. You're still maintaining an upper body position. So you have those same elements that you had with the single leg stretch. You just reduce the lever length. So instead of having a long leg, you've got a folded leg. Okay? It allows you to explore a little bit through the pelvis what happens when you extend the leg and bend the leg. Okay? Which is kind of what we're talking about here with our hip and pelvis term. So that's one option. Another option, particularly for those, if we pair it right back and have a look just at what's happening through the hips. So we take the abdominals away, you're laying down. It's the same exercise, the toe tap exercise. So that action there, you're exploring your ability to work through hip flexion, hip extension, and also pelvic stability. So we can really pair it right back. And if I think about it, if we go back in the evolution of our single leg stretch one step further, we go back to the first class you've ever done. Okay, so the beginner's class, the first one you ever turned up to, the single leg lift. So that action there, it's the same. So if we have a look at the evolution, the single leg lift, then the double leg lift, okay, and then holding that double leg lift for the toe taps, okay, and then what we can do is ask you to hold a chest lift, still doing the toe taps, okay, and then we can bring the hands down here and do the toe taps, okay, see how it evolves, okay, and then start to ask you to extend. Maybe you're not ready to go for full extension, okay, and then you work your range of motion, building it up into that full range of motion. So there you go. Some options for you to try at home, and you can see the progression that you're aiming to go to. So that's the single leg stretch for our hip and pelvis term. All right, make sure you subscribe to keep following on, and maybe have a look at the rest of the exercises in the hip and pelvis tutorial playlist. Okay, good luck with everything.